Good morning. Today we are starting the lecture series for modern India. So we'll be covering almost a time frame of 350 years to see how the European companies entered India, how the British triumphed, how we were ruled by the British, what were the various events that happened, how the national struggle went by, and finally how we got the independence in 1947. So before we actually start, I would like to clarify certain things about modern India. Now when we study ancient and medieval India and now we are studying modern India, there are little bit differences. 2-3 reasons why. In ancient and medieval India, the focus generally is on the sources because we don't know whether the events have really happened or not. So literary source, archaeological source, these are very important for ancient and medieval India. For modern India, there is no source as such. Like nobody is going to ask you whether civil disobedience movement happened or not. So the events in modern India are well established that this is how it happened. They have been well reported in the press. They have been written down in multiple sources. So there is no need for sources in modern India. Modern India is more about analysis. The event happened. Like for example, civil disobedience. It happened, correct. Why did it happen? What were the forces that made it happen? What were the factors that led to happening of the civil disobedience movement, or what was its impact? Why did it fizzle out? These analytical statements are something which are very important for modern India. So modern India is more about analysis more than any kind of fact base. Of course, fact base is important, but any kind of marks that we get in UPSC are more based on the analysis that we give. The second reason why modern India is different is because we have heard it's very near to us. Like in history, the more you go in the past, our historical vision gets blurred. But naturally, because it is in the past. The moment that thing comes closer to us, the moment we come close to modern India, the history becomes clearer. So the characters that are there in modern India are most of us we have heard about it. Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, Savarkar, or we have heard about Indian National Congress. We have heard about multiple national struggles, civil disobedience movement, non-cooperation movement, Quit India movement, or we have heard about the various social reforms, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, this and that. So names of the leaders and the events are quite known to us. So that's why it is a little bit easier to study modern India because it's not totally unknown. The things continue to be in discussion every time. There is some or the other debate that happens. Was Gandhi good or bad? How did partition happen? This and that. Was the extremists good or the moderates were good? Or what Bhagat Singh could his suicide be, could his hanging till death could have been prevented or not? So these are very common questions that continue to be there in the entire discussion. So it's very easy to grasp modern India. And the third reason and the most important reason is we have studied modern India in our textbooks. Till 10th standard in whatever history we have studied, as compared to the ancient and medieval times, we have studied modern India much more. So there is some faint memory of things that are happening. So it's not totally unknown. We are not venturing into that territory which is totally not known to us or never taught to us. So learning modern India is a little bit easier than ancient and medieval India. The only difference being, as I said, it is more about analysis more than any kind of sources that we are quoting. So in the entire series of these lectures, we will not just deal about the facts, we will deal with the analysis of it. Because in an examination, since you are going to write the UPSC paper, whether it is for GS or for the optional, analysis becomes very important. The moment that examiner comes to know that this candidate knows what he is writing, he knows the different angles to that event, that very moment the examiner simply cannot cut the marks, he has to give you the marks. So that is why history is easy as well as tough. It is easy because it is analytical and easy to understand, but it is tough because if you really can't present different perspectives of the event, you will not get marks. That is also the reason why many people don't score in history, is because they just go there and blurt out the facts, irrespective of what the question is asking. And then they say that, okay, we wrote the entire paper, but हमें mark ही नहीं मिला, हमारे marks में आ नहीं. Then that is not done. So you have to have analysis in history. So today we are going to start the first lecture of modern India. Before that, I personally want to take you through the timeline of modern India. The most important thing that I am insistent on when teaching history is timeline should be clear. Because history at the end of the day is a chronological study of events in the past. Chronological. We should know what event happened when. This is also important for having an analysis. So if I want to connect, say, the Quit India movement to the Second World War, I must know that Quit India happened in 42. And I must also know that the World War II began in 1939 and it has some impact on Quit India movement. So for studying things parallelly also, a clarity on the timeline is needed. So when we will study about modern India, we will also have some linkages to world history, because we have to not forget that we were colonized by a British power, by a European power. So naturally what is happening in the European subcontinent is also important for what events will happen in India. So this kind of a cross referencing is needed, and for that timeline is very, very necessary. So once you fit your timeline, even if you are studying ancient and medieval India or world history, timeline is very, very clear. So next time when you get to study any part of history, first clarify yourself with the timeline. So first let's go through the timeline. So I'll give you a rough broad overview of what events happened and what we are going to cover. So the first and the most important thing is 31st December 1600 when the East India Company was formed. We'll start from there because we were ruled by the British East India Company. The second, the broad timeline that I'll cover is 1600 to 1757. Why 1757 is because that is the year of Battle of Plassey in Bengal, the first successful battle of British in India. So you will have 1600 to 1757 is a general time of expansion. These European companies have entered multiple, British, French, Portuguese, Dutch, they have entered India and they are slowly trying to spread in India. So this is the general time where the British are trying to get foothold in India. 1757 to 1765 is where you will have the British increasing their foothold in India. So you might have heard about, after Battle of Plassey in Bengal, there was a Battle of Buxar. We have studied this in our schools. So that is where the British finally annexed Bengal. It is a very, very watershed year for modern India. From 1765 to 1818, so roughly about 50 years, this is where the British now start aggressively expanding in India. They start to conquer various types of major kingdoms that are there in India. So the most important being, of course, the Maratha kingdom. That's why the year is 1818, because 1818 is the year where the Maratha Empire fell. And before that, you have the Mysore, the Nizams and everybody falling prey to the British annexation. From 1818 to 1857, you will have further British conquest, but through different ways and means. So you will have Punjab and Sindh and all the other things being captured under the British Empire. And now finally the East India Company's empire in India stretches from Punjab till southern Kanyakumari. So it was a huge empire that they finally built up in till 1857. So you might have remembered Lord Dalhousie and his doctrine of lapse. You might have studied it in our schools. So we will look into that also. The next important, of course, watershed movement is 1857. So 1857 is when the Great Revolt of 1857 happened. It was mainly concentrated in the northern parts of India. It was brutally suppressed, but the most important outcome came was that the company rule was abolished and Indian Empire was officially taken over by the Queen of England. So British India became an official part of England. So that is the most important part of 1857. From 1857 till about 1885, this is the rise of nationalist activity. So now the Indians start to realize that okay, we are being ruled by a foreign power and it's not favorable for us to be ruled by a foreign power. We should group ourselves, we should become politically aware, we should start some political activity and demand something from the British in return. Maybe some political power, economic power, better trade, better representation in the entire legislative bodies of the British. That is where the nationalist activity starts, and that is where you will find that Indian political consciousness begins to rise. So you will have the British actually giving some or the other concessions, Indians regrouping themselves into various political groups. With the culmination in 1885, you will have the Indian National Congress being established, INC, which is the most important player in the entire history of our national struggle. After 1885, we can say that officially our national struggle started, and we will have multiple stakeholders, not just the Congress, but within the Congress also we had extremists and moderates. Beyond that, we had the revolutionaries of various kind. You had the communists, you had the socialists, you had the Hindu Mahasabha, and many other people who actually came in and they began contributing in their own way to the national struggle. So entire activity, the real fun begins after 1885, because that is where you will find that every year becomes very important. So till 1885, you will actually find that in our lectures, we will actually quickly come to 1885, because in between there is not much activity. The after 1885, especially after 1905, you will have every year, every 2-3 years, something is happening, and something which is very important for our syllabus in history. So, in these 14 lectures, since we are taking it for 14 days, there is a possibility that there may be a bombardment of facts, because of course we are going to go a little bit deeper in history. So don't get intimidated, don't get frightened, because these lectures are going to be available to you even later on. You can take notes. The basic purpose of this lecture series is to fit facts in your brain. The moment facts become fit in your brain, you may forget them immediately. No problem, no issues at all, because we are not Einsteins to remember everything. But after your prelims, when you start studying for the mains and you again open up and start reading the textbooks, then your mind will tell you that, I've listened this somewhere, I've heard this somewhere, this was taught, I have taken note of it. So when you read that thing 2-3 times, then those facts and analysis will be fit in your brain. So don't worry for now whether this entire lecture, are you able to remember everything? No, not necessary. Don't get intimidated. Don't feel that you are being bombarded with facts. Just understand what is being taught. That is the entire purpose of this lecture series. And then later on when you will revise, then you will realize that, okay, this lecture series work, it created a base for your brain to build upon modern India. So that is the purpose of this lecture series. After 1885, you will have 1885 to about 1905, the moderate phase. So you have moderates coming up. So Mahadev Govind Ranade, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Firoz Shah Mehta, and all these people are the leaders of the moderate movement, which believed in appeasement of the British to get some concessions in return. So this is a moderate phase where you will find that some or the other activities going on, but only at an elite level and not at a mass level. The things changed in 1905. So what I have written down is the Swadeshi movement. So the Swadeshi movement happened in 1905. We will see why it happened, why the first partition of Bengal happened, and how it triggered the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. And finally, this is a watershed year for the moderates to slowly recede and the extremists to take hold. And extremists under Lokmanya Tilak and all the other people started to assert themselves under this time. They were already active earlier also, but this time that was the peak of the extremist phase. And you will find that finally the Congress had a split in 1907, and that created a huge problem. So till 1916 roughly, you will have the nationalist movement going into a lull, as in there is very less activity. It was sort of a dormant nationalist movement. Also, you should know that in 1914, the First World War broke out. So the moment the First World War broke out, naturally it is going to trigger some events in India, because India is a part of British India or Britain, and that's why we were sucked into the war. There were people from India who were participating in the war, and we suffered a lot of problems because of the First World War. And that is the reason why there is certain impetus to nationalist activity that comes after the breaking out of the First World War. So you will find that roughly the revolutionaries in this time, from 1906 to 1916 roughly, you will have the revolutionaries. We might have heard about Prafulla Chaki and Khudiram Bose and all these people. So these people were existing in this time, Madan Lal Dhingra and all those people. And you have the Gadar movement of the Sikhs. So there is some activity going on, but not really the activity we expected to. Things changed after 1916. Slowly the Congress and the Muslim League came together, and you will have the Congress finally getting back to some activity. You have Annie Besant and Lokmanya Tilak's Home Rule League in this time, and you will also find that about 1915-1916 you have the entry of the most important character, hero or villain otherwise, doesn't matter, but the most important character of modern India, that is Gandhi. So Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returns to India in 1915, and he begins touring India, and you will have his other satyagrahas, the Champaran Satyagraha, Kheda Satyagraha, and the Ahmedabad Mill strike, and all these things happening. And Gandhiji now starts to take hold on the Indian mind. And by 1919, when the First World War is over, the British pass a draconian act called Rowlatt Act, and we will see what happened about it. As a protest to it, there is a Rowlatt Act Satyagraha of Gandhiji, and there is a Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar. So you will have these major events happening in 1919, and finally you will have Gandhiji starting his first major movement of non-cooperation movement, coupled with the Khilafat movement of the Muslims, that is in 1920. So 1920 to 1922 is the time where the non-cooperation movement, the first major movement, national movement
to break out against the British. This is basically the non-cooperation movement where Gandhiji proves his leadership, that he can actually lead the Indians. From 1922 to 1930, this about the decade of 1920s is again, you can say that the Congress tried to have its propaganda through legislature. So they got elected into legislatures. We will see to it. We will see who are the Swarajists and who are the no changers. And the nationalist activity was happening, but it was more happening in the political front in the legislatures rather than a national movement. But again, the British gave us a trigger. We all have heard about the Simon Commission. So the Simon go back wala stuff. In 1927, the Simon Commission came. Not a single Indian was there. The Indians protested. You will have Bhagat Singh and his people also avenging the death of Lala Lajpat Rai. And this is also the time for the revolutionary activities of Bhagat Singh. And slowly you will find that in 1929, the Congress declares that its aim is Purna Swaraj. So we want full independence. And in 1930, again, the Congress mobilizes people. And in 1930 to 1932, you have the civil disobedience movement. This is the second major movement after 10 years of non-cooperation. So this is the second big movement of the civil disobedience movement. After that movement slowly fizzled out. From 1930 to about 1935, you will have again problems about the British governance. The British are trying to have a new constitution and new setup for India. You might have heard this when you've been studying polity. Government of India Act 1935 is a major and the most important act on which even our today's constitution is based. So that act was passed in 1935, and this entire till 1935, this period was more about constitutional debates. We will be studying about round table conferences that happened in Britain. After 1935, you will have the 1935 Act allowed the Indians to fight and totally take control of the provincial state governments. So the Congress fought elections. So 1937 to roughly about 1940, we have the Congress rule in various provinces. So out of the 11 provinces that we had in British India, 8 were ruled by the Congress and the others were by some other smaller parties. So you will find that Congress finally tastes power in 1937, at least at the state level, that is the provincial level. But again, some world event shakes the entire calculations. We have Adolf Hitler invading Poland on 1st of September 1939 and World War II begins. And Britain pulls India into the war, and now the entire things change because now Britain wants the support of Indians. It cannot afford Indians protesting against Britain when Britain is fighting war in Europe. So naturally you will find that Britain is now more into getting support of the Indians. So it is giving more and more concessions to the Indians. It is accepting what Indians want. So you will have in 1940 the first big offer, that is the August offer. We will see what it is. In 1942, you have second offer called as the Cripps Mission that's coming to India for deciding what constitutional amendments or changes India should have after the war ends. And this is also the time for Quit India movement. This entire Quit India movement is almost like the British were weak and the Congress is now again using its do and die methods to ensure that this is a final push for the British to be kicked out of India. And this became a bigger watershed movement because from now on, after 1942, there is no big movement in India. What happens is more of constitutional debates. It is almost clear that the British are going to leave India, but how and what? And it is in this 1940s decade that the issue of partition and Muslim communal politics comes up, where they want a separate nation in the name of religion. So we will also see that. Roughly till 1945, you have these talks going on. Congress is also in hectic debates with the Muslim League about how independence should be there. How can the demand of Pakistan be considered without partitioning India? And you have, of course, Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army also trying to attempt a Japanese invasion of India. That was in 1944. So till 1945, when the Second World War ended, these were the things that were happening. Then you will find in 1946 the last attempt by the British. It is the cabinet mission being sent to India, which will finally lay down the base for what will happen in the future. 1946 also starts with a lot of communal riots that are happening, the most prominent being the Direct Action Day. And finally in 1947, we have Lord Mountbatten coming to India, and India becomes partitioned, but India becomes independent on 15th of August 1947. Whoosh, finally. So finally India has gained independence. So all this thing will be covered in 14 lectures. We will also be seeing other aspects which I have not mentioned here. Socio-religious movements. We will be seeing the constitutional acts that the government had passed, from Regulating Act 1773 right up till the Government of India Act 1935. We will see the various stakeholders of the freedom movement, be it the communists, the socialists, the Hindu Mahasabha. We will see freedom movement from the angle of various communities or groups in India. So peasants, tribals, women, Dalits, labor movement, how these people were functioning during the freedom struggle. We will also see these angles. So you will find that a kind of a very comprehensive 360-degree picture is being attempted to be given in this lecture series. So we will be covering all of this in those 14 lectures. So as far as today's lecture essentially goes, what I am interested in teaching today is the entry of European companies into India. So essentially today's lecture is more about how the European companies began to come to India, how they began to spread their tentacles, and slowly how did the British finally triumph in getting hold of at least some chunk of India and defeating other European companies. That is what we are going to study today. So let's start with today's lecture. I hope this timeline is clear. You can just scroll back to this video and note down this timeline also. It is very good to revise timelines because it clears your brain. So you can do that. Okay, so now let's start with today's lecture. So all this was just an introduction sake. We wasted about 20 minutes for that. Okay, never mind. Why did Europeans feel like coming to India? Now, European trade was there with India. We all know how the earliest examples being the Greeks coming to India through Alexander. We have Megasthenes. Later on, we had Indo-Greeks, and there was a land trade and sea trade that used to happen through Europe to India by the Greek and the Roman Empire. This trade continued even in the medieval times and early medieval times and in the medieval times. Till that time, it was a land trade. So if you see the map that I have shown to you, so there is India. Try to trace a land route through the Khyber Pass, entirely through Iran and those regions, into the Middle East, through Turkey and through the Black Sea and directly into Europe. So this was the most prominent route of the British, French or any other European trade into India. The problem started in 1453. You might have heard about the Ottoman Turks. So the Ottoman Turks, Ottoman is just a European way of pronouncing the word Usman. So Usman is just converted into Ottoman. So Ottoman Turks captured Turkey. So this part above the Saudi Peninsula is essentially the Middle East, and just above that near the Black Sea is Turkey. That is where Constantinople is. And when the Turks captured Constantinople, they simply cut off the land trade routes from Europe to India. Cut off. Because now they simply won't allow the European traders to pass through Constantinople, through Turkey, into Iraq, Iran and to India. That was not allowed. So once the Turks block the land routes, what is the most obvious option? That the British, French, Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, anybody will first take to the seas. That we have a sea connection to India. That is more important. So you will find that in these times, Europe was also going through a period called Renaissance. And a new stream of thought was coming. In the 14th and the 15th century, we also have slowly the European kings and the royalties also liberalizing trade, because they saw that there is some profitability attached to the trade, and hence they should ensure that trade happens properly. So what happened was that the first movers in all of this were the Spanish and the Portuguese. So if you look at Europe, the southeasternmost part of is Spain and Portugal. So they were the most open to Atlantic Ocean, and naturally they were the ones to start exploring the seas. So as a by the way thing, you will be interested to know that the Pope actually drew, the Pope, that is the Christian head sitting at Vatican, actually drew a straight line through Europe, north-south on the map. All the areas to the left side of it, that is North America and South America, were left to the Spanish, that the Spanish should capture it. That's why you have Spaniards, Amerigo Vespucci and all the other Columbus people going to North America and South America, and Spaniards being colonizing these regions, and all areas right to it on the map, that is Africa and Asia, were given to the Portuguese. So the first people to actually take that initiative to come and discover sea routes from Europe to Africa to Asia were the Portuguese, because that is the lands that the Pope gave to them for discovery. So you will have, and naturally the Pope is giving them the right to discovery. The condition is also clear that the moment you conquer those lands, you should convert those people to Christianity, because that is also one of the aim of the traders. So the Portuguese finally start with the aim of exploring the seas. Naturally, this is the time for good technology also, because sailing through the sea is not a kid's play, because you have to ensure you know the winds, you know how calculate the wind speed, the direction, how to use the astrolabe to decide the direction. So all these technologies with proper ships, trading ships which can be loaded with goods, that technology was first developed by the Portuguese. So if you actually see, the innovators of sea trade are Portuguese. Today we consider everything as the British because we were ruled by the British, but that's not the reality. Britain was nowhere in this time. So you will find that the Portuguese were the first ones who started all this. They got license from the Pope to explore Asia and Africa. They started to sail. So I've shown it on the map also. This is a map with respect to the Dutch, so you will have Amsterdam shown, but the routes are clear. That from the Atlantic way through Africa, you have the Cape of Good Hope, exactly in the southernmost corner of Africa. So that is the resting place where they have sailed through Africa, through the southern Indian Ocean and crossing Madagascar, Mauritius region, you will come into the Indian Ocean, and that is where you actually land into India. If you decide to utilize the monsoon winds and again go further, then you can actually reach the Southeast Asian regions. So that is how the land sea route was discovered to Africa and India specifically. The Portuguese were the first ones to do that. And I guess I need not tell you who was the first one. We all know who was the first one. So it was Vasco da Gama. We have all heard this name. We have studied this in schools, and we generally know it as a matter of fact. In 1498, you have Vasco da Gama with his ships coming to Calicut. Calicut is in Kerala. Naturally, Kerala is in the southernmost tip of India. So that was the first region where any normal European trader would reach. So they first reached to Calicut. Naturally, Kerala was at that point of time known for spice trade. So it was profitable enterprise for Vasco da Gama because he took away all the spices and sold at exorbitant prices in Europe and gained profit. Because after all, what was Portuguese East India Company? It was a company, right? It was there for money. That they are traders. So what they will do is they will take loans from the king or from anywhere in Europe. They will utilize that money to finally sail to India or sail back to India. That money will be utilized to buy spices and all the other exclusive products in India. They will bring it back and sell it at 4 times, 10 times, 20 times the price and gain profit, pay back the loans and keep the profit for themselves. So that is the trade model of all of these East India companies which was followed. It was fundamentally altered only in the late 18th century by the British, where India became the center for raw products, the center for taking away raw products and bringing finished goods from Britain. What is basically known as the Industrial Revolution that happened in England. We'll see that later on. For now, Vasco da Gama reaches Calicut in 1498. Naturally, the Portuguese have now found the land route for India. There were many other Portuguese who went further and discovered other places in Southeast Asia. They went to the Malacca Strait, Java and Sumatra Islands, etc. etc. Now the Portuguese say that fine, we have got a hold onto India, but we are not going to be just traders. Boss, we want some power, we want some land, we want to take control, and we have to ensure that we take maximum land and coastal areas under our control. So the Portuguese essentially started to conquer many parts in India, especially on the west coast of India, because that was the most easily accessible through Europe. So the Portuguese essentially were there in Kerala, but ultimately the Travancore kings and the Zamorins and actually did not entertain them much. So the Portuguese could not get any major control of Kerala. So they shifted a little bit north. So you have in 1510 the Portuguese actively attacking Goa. You have Alfonso Albuquerque. He is the commander of the Portuguese. It is on this Alfonso's name that we have the Alfonso mango named. So Alfonso Albuquerque, because the Portuguese essentially brought the mango from Mexico. So this man Alfonso Albuquerque leads Portuguese victory in Goa in 1510. So from 1510 right up till 1961 when the Portuguese finally left Goa. Just imagine the colonial venture. For 450 years, the Portuguese had their base in Goa and they finally left in 1961 when they were thrown out, not because they voluntarily withdrew from it. So the Portuguese started to take their hold in Goa. The second strategy that the Portuguese said was that we have discovered the sea route to India. So we will dominate the trade. So in medieval India, when you will study something called as a Cartaz system. Cartaz is essentially a Portuguese name for charter. So if you are an Indian and you have a ship and you want to trade in the Arabian Sea or Indian Ocean in general, you need a charter of permission from the Portuguese that I am being permitted by the Portuguese to trade. If I don't get that charter and if the Portuguese naval ships get hold of my ship, they reserve the right to sink my ship and take away all the material that I have. So this is Dadagiri. To put plain, this is Dadagiri that is happening. The Portuguese tried to become the underworld of the seas. As simple as that. So if you want to do any trade, you seek permission from us, you give us a commission and only then you are permitted. If you don't, we will destroy you. So that is Dadagiri on the seas. You will also find in these times that the Portuguese king declared himself as the lord of the oceans. So you see how the Portuguese were thinking that if we discovered the sea route, we are the ones who are going to control it at any cost. So the Portuguese essentially started to dominate the seas, and this is the second strategy. The third strategy of the Portuguese is where you are dominant on the seas, but you need naval bases, right? You can't just continuously be sailing into the sea. You need strong naval bases where your ships can come and dock. Those strong naval bases need to be fortified, and if at all a war breaks out, that naval base can be a center for providing all the supplies for the ships. So the third and the most important strategy of the Portuguese is to set up naval bases on the western coast of India. They set up naval bases even in the Arabic region. They set up the bases even in the Malacca Strait. But India is where the Portuguese were concentrating. So if you see, all the major Portuguese settlements are on the sea coast, and all the major Portuguese settlements are essentially fortified forts, proper forts. So if you actually start from the Gujarat region, you will be seeing that the Diu and Daman area, today they are union territories, but Diu and Daman were Portuguese settlements. There are forts on the coast. I'll show you the pictures also. You will have the fort at Vasai. We all know how the Marathas heroically conquered the fort at Vasai under Chimaji Appa. So the fort at Vasai is there. Bombay, essentially entire Bombay was first a Portuguese colony. It later on went to the British people. We'll see how. But essentially the British got hold of Bombay in 1662. Before that it was the Portuguese who were ruling Sashti and the 7 islands of Bombay. Then you have Revdanda in Raigad district. You have Dabhol. You have Vengurla, and of course you have all the important ports in Goa. So these are all fortified settlements. You find Portuguese forts exist even there, even today. If you go to Mumbai, you will find a place in Bandra called Bandstand, where there is a Bandra fort. That Bandra fort is essentially built by the Portuguese. So you will find that this strategy of building strong forts along the sea coast so that they can be used as naval bases to fight wars in the sea. The Portuguese were the innovators of this. All the British and the French settlements that came later on along the coast were essentially copies of the Portuguese strategy. So what will happen is the Portuguese will come, let's say Vasai. Portuguese will set up their factories at Vasai where they will trade with the common people. So the Portuguese traders will go and bring finished products from India, and that trade will happen at the factory. That factory is totally fortified, so nobody from Indian side can really attack them. There is a dock. There is a ship there, and that ship will essentially ship all that thing to Portugal, and then there are military ships also which will continue to have military dominance over the seas. Doesn't it sound really similar to the British strategy? Like the British, when they got their factory at Surat, they did the same thing, right? Surat is essentially on the banks of the Tapi and the sea. So you will find that easy access to the sea. You will find the same thing happening in Kolkata, Chandannagar, in Madras, in Pondicherry, in all the other regions. You will have sea settlements, strong naval bases being adopted by French and the British, but they were all copycats. They copied it from the Portuguese. So the Portuguese are essentially the innovators in sea trade, discovering of sea routes, dominating the seas, and setting up strategic naval bases along the coast of India. So that is what the Portuguese did throughout the 1500s and 1600s. The third point, that's why I've mentioned that the expansion of Portuguese essentially takes place at Diu, Daman, Dabhol, Vengurla, and then they try to expand even in the Southeast Asian region by setting up bases at Colombo, multiple places in Malacca Strait, as well as in Gulf of Aden. Gulf of Aden is essentially the Saudi region, because that is also an important port, and if you control the Gulf of Aden, you can control the trade that happens through Africa. So Africa, eastern coast of Africa and India, these two were also trading at that point of time. So you can see how comprehensively they are thinking of dominance over especially the Arabian Sea. So that is how the Portuguese slowly expanded their footprint into India. You will find that in 1580, however, the Portuguese faced the biggest problem. So the Spanish people were the Chads of those days, all badass people. They said, okay, Portuguese, you go and set up bases all throughout the world. Fair enough, kar lo, jo karna hai. We don't care. We will conquer your mother country itself. So the Spanish essentially attacked the Portugal country itself, and they took hold of Portugal. They dethroned the king. So na bajega baas, na rahega baas, na bajegi basuri. So you can conquer all these places throughout the world. We will conquer our mother country so that all the colonies throughout the world automatically come to us. So they conquered Portuguese. They destroyed the Portuguese navy. So the Spanish navy was called as Armada, from where the Marathi word armar is used for navy. So the Spanish Armada essentially defeated the Portuguese, and Spain captured Portugal in 1580. And that was a big drawback and setback for the Portuguese expansion in India. The British were one step ahead. They said, okay, fair enough. The Spanish people defeated the Portuguese. Now we will defeat the Spanish. So in 1588, the British defeated the Spanish Armada, and Portugal was again essentially freed. So you will find that the Portuguese expansion again begins in the 1600s. So this one major problem that the Portuguese faced in 1580s, apart from that, again the Portuguese expansion started in the 1600s. Naturally, around this time in 1600s, the British were also gaining a foothold in India. So there was a war between the British and the Portuguese, and Portuguese being essentially lower on technology, because the British were quite capable in those days, the Portuguese could not spread much. So you will find that the Portuguese generally limited themselves to all these bases that I mentioned. So Dadra and Nagar Haveli, Diu, Daman, Goa, these are the major places where the Portuguese got their control restricted and the British restricted them. I am deliberately not mentioning Vasai, because Vasai was the most important Portuguese port and the region, even more important than Goa. They ruled it till 1739. Imagine that they conquered this region sometime in 1500s, and for almost 200 years they ruled up till 1739. And it is finally, this was the time for the Maratha Empire. So the Peshwa sent his brother Chimaji Appa there, and through many other Maratha soldiers, they finally finished the Portuguese hold of Vasai, and the entire Bombay, Thana, Palghar, entire region was freed of the Portuguese. So the Portuguese till when they left in 1961, they were only in control of Dadra, Nagar Haveli, Diu, Daman and Goa. These were the only regions they controlled. So the Portuguese venture in India essentially laid the base for European entry into India. They discovered a sea route. They set up the strategy of how you have to set up strong bases and everything. And the other European nations essentially built up on this strategy. So that is how the Portuguese laid down the base for European expansion in India. So let's see some photos. You will realize. See, the upper one is the Diu fort at Diu. Just see the entire fortified fort and exactly present at the sea coast. So tomorrow, if somebody from the Indian side attacks, you can just sit in your ships and go into the sea, because Indians did not have good navy then. So you can just sit into the sea and go away. And when the Indian attack recedes, you can again attack via merchant ships and take hold of that naval settlement again. So this is the strategically they thought. They were traders, but how militarily they thought about it. Same goes to the Vasai fort. Look at the Vasai fort. It's a huge settlement. Huge. At any given point of time, 2,000 Portuguese could easily live within the Vasai fort, and it is exactly at the sea. A river also meets the sea at that point of time. So you will have the Vasai fort again exactly meant to be there on the sea. So that is essentially the Portuguese strategy of building strong military settlements at the coast. Now we will go to another European power. the Dutch East India Company. So the Netherlands, essentially, they are the Dutch people. You will find that after the Spaniards and the Portugal, the Dutch were very much active in starting such kind of companies and trying to establish trade relations with India. The Dutch were more interested in spice trade because spices were not grown in Europe, they were grown only in India and Southeast Asia, and they were the most important ingredients for the European food because European food is essentially tasteless. साल्यांना काय खाण्याची काय टेस्ट नाही आहे, त्यांना ते सगळं ब्लँड आळणीच खातात ते घाणेरडी लोक. पण never mind. So basically the Europeans were crazy for spices. So the Dutch essentially now concentrated their hold on spice trade. Portuguese, I told you, had already discovered land route to India. The Dutch in 1602, almost 100 years after the Portuguese, set their foothold on India. So see how innovators the Portuguese were. In 1602, you have the Dutch East India Company being set up. 1602. This is the first experiment of any company, trading company, which is a joint stock company, as in it is a proper shareholding company. So today also, if you want to set up a company, I list it and I have shareholders so that I can raise money from the market and I'll use that money to do business, whatever I want to do. So these Dutch people actually had the Dutch East India Company being set up as a joint stock company, properly listed on the markets. There were shareholders who bought the shares of Dutch East India Company, and so that this company got money to initially buy ships and fund all their trade to India. This company naturally needed support from the monarchy because without the support of the kings in Europe, Europe was not a democracy then, mind you, they were all kingdoms. So the support from the Dutch king was also important. So this received an exclusive charter from the Dutch king to trade with East parts of the world, East Indies and India. So you will have this Dutch East India Company finally setting their foothold on India. They came to India in 1605, but the problem was that the Portuguese, the British were quite strong then in India, and they were more powerful in their naval tactics than the Dutch. So the Dutch essentially decided that, okay, let's leave India. We will have some bases in India, but our focus will be Southeast Asia. So through Sri Lanka, then right up to the Malacca Strait and into the islands of near the South China Sea, that is where the Dutch began concentrating because that is also the place where spices could be properly grown. So the Dutch did set up some foothold in India. So you see, I've mentioned some names. So in the Surat region, the Malabar region or the Kerala region, Chinnasura, Masulipattana, Pulicat, these were certain Indian places where you will find the Dutch did exist. But they were defeated and finally they could not get hold in India. So they decided to concentrate on spice trade through Southeast Asia. So the Dutch East Indies, or the land that they conquered in Southeast Asia, the Dutch East Indies, continued to be in their hold right till the Second World War, that is till 1945, when finally the Japanese captured it and the Japan was defeated and this region was liberated. So this Dutch East Indies, which was in control in Southeast Asia, today is known as Indonesia. So this entire region was controlled by the Dutch since in 1600s, whenever they got hold of it, till the Second World War. So see, this is also one of the longest colonial venture we can see, just like the Portuguese. So the Dutch essentially began their trade in Indonesia. They did try to gain foothold in India, but there were wars with the British. So there were many Anglo-Dutch wars. So British and Dutch fought wars in India for dominance in the seas, and you will find that the British finally triumphed, and in about mid 1700s and then finally in 1800s, the settlement was signed between the British and the Dutch, and the British said that the Dutch will have no or limited presence in India. They should concentrate on Indonesia and other regions and leave India for the British. So that kind of settlement was happened and the Dutch were thrown out of India. So the Dutch did try to gain a foothold, but they could not gain that foothold. This is the Dutch East India Company. This is some rough pictorial representation that I found, which will explain to you. This is the Dutch factory at Hooghly. Hooghly river, you see in Bengal, it flows north-south on the banks of Kolkata is there on the banks of Hooghly, and it meets the Bay of Bengal. Near the Bay of Bengal, there is too much of siltation that happens. The mud from the Ganga is there. So no port can be really built exactly at Bay of Bengal. So you have to build your factory and ports on the Hooghly River, and from there through the ships you can directly access the sea. So you will find that on the Hooghly River, you have all the big British, French, Dutch, Danish East India companies building their settlements. So at Calcutta, it was built by the British. Just north of Calcutta, on the banks of Hooghly, we have Chandan Nagar, where the French base was there, and a little bit north of it in all these regions you have the Danish and the Dutch settlement. So this is the Dutch settlement at Hooghly. Just see how it is fortified. So you can find that an entire fortification is there around it, and on the other side, the left side, there is a Hooghly River flowing where ships are seen. On the right side, apparently that may be an Indian settlement or a bazaar where the Dutch actually used to procure all the finished goods from India. So that is roughly how a factory settlement looks, and this is how generally British and the Portuguese all set up their settlements. This ruin that you are seeing, you can see they are bricks and properly, but all are ruined. This is a Dutch settlement at Vengurla. So this is a history of Konkan which generally nobody talks. We only know of British settlements at Rajapur and all these regions because we study Maratha history. We know of Portuguese settlements at Vengurla, at Revdanda, Bombay and all the regions. But we generally don't study the Dutch history. So there were many Dutch factories even at the coast of Konkan region. So this is a destroyed Dutch factory at Vengurla. So I felt like sharing this. This is a very, so there is some relevance to this history. So we are not studying history in randomness. There is some physical proof of this settlement which exists. So that's why I wanted to tell you that we are not studying anything in thin air. This is what has happened, and you will find proofs of all these things even today. Okay, now let's come to the third most important European power, the French East India Company. Now the French, as usual, are always late movers and early withdrawals. If you see the French history in Second World War also, you will see that the French just easily gave up to Hitler. So the French are always relaxed. They will start late and they will give up early also. So the French East India Company is no different. They started their company in 1664. So Portuguese came in 1500, the Dutch came in 1600. Yes, these people established their companies in 1664. Finally, the French monarch decided कि चलो भाई, let's trade with India. In this time, you had the Bourbon dynasty in France. जे बोर्बनची बिस्किट खाता आपण ते Bourbon. The Bourbon dynasty of France. So you might have heard names of the kings, Louis the 10th, 12th, and everything. And when the French Revolution happened finally in 1789, you had Louis the 16th as the king. So this Bourbon dynasty is ruling in France. They see how British and Portuguese and Spanish are governing the seas and getting trade and earning money. So the French also now feel like, okay, let's enter this trade. So the French East India Company is set up in 1664, very, very late. You will have the first factory being set up at Surat in 1668. So again, finally the French come back to where the British are already there, because British factory at Surat was a bustling place in this time. The French try to establish their bases at multiple regions in India. The French finally discover a new region, that is Pondicherry, just north of Madras, and you have this is a good port. If you study ancient India, there was already a bustling port in those times called Arikamedu. So Arikamedu, archaeological excavations have happened, and that's a bustling port which traded with Southeast Asia as well as Rome in those days. And because it's a good area for having a port, so on that region itself, the French set up their base at Pondicherry. This is a very important fact that you should remember, because when we will, in the next part, we will deal with the Anglo-French wars. This Pondicherry settlement is going to be at the center of it. So this Pondicherry is important. You will have in 1692 the French getting their settlement at Chandan Nagar. So I told you, on the Hooghly River we have Kolkata, and at just to the north of Calcutta you have Chandan Nagar. The French set up their base. So it's like almost they're like copying the British. Like the British are there at Surat, French तिथे पण पोचले. They are there at Calcutta, तिथे पण French पोचले. So we will find that everywhere the British go, the French are there. So essentially copycats, nothing more. So you will have the French setting up their entire settlements at multiple places in India. You will have Masulipatna, Mahe and Karaikal and all these regions. That is where the French exist. Again, note down these names: Mahe, Karaikal, Pondicherry, because this is where the French continued to rule in India even after independence. So the French left India in 1954. So again, this is also a big myth that India was totally free of European domination in 1947. No, the British left in 1947, correct. The French left in 1954. They continued to rule Pondicherry, Mahe, Karaikal, Yanam and all these regions. And finally, the Portuguese left in 1961 from Goa. That is when India really got free from any colonial domination. So the French came up in 1664 and they slowly started to expand into India. The French East India Company is very important because the Portuguese slowly were restricted. The Dutch were defeated. So only the two main European powers that remain in India are the French and the British. So naturally, when the British want to gain dominance in India, defeating of French is absolutely necessary. Without defeating the French, you cannot get a foothold in India. So we will also be seeing the Anglo-French wars. But before that, I guess there is some photos. This is the French settlement at Hooghly at Chandan Nagar. So you can see how they have essentially built up embankments on the Hooghly river, and on the other side you have the French settlement. If you go to Chandan Nagar, it is like that even today. Okay, now we come to the real boss, that is the East India Company of the British. This is where the entire East India Company, the history of this East India Company is important for us, because this is where actually these people finally triumphed in India. So I have brought to you the logo of the East India Company. So just see how it is, East India Company is written down, and just below the lions you will find something written in Latin: Auspiciо Regis et Senatus Angli. This is a Latin phrase. It basically means that this East India Company has been set up by Auspicio Regis, by the blessings of the king, and Senatus Angli, and by a law passed in the Parliament of England. So Senate is essentially the Parliament of England. So essentially what the British are trying to tell you is that this East India Company has the blessings of the king and a charter from the Parliament of Britain. So this is a very legal company. And if you actually see those lions, I just feel like laughing at those lions. Look at those lions. I don't know, zero figure che lion hai, literally. Look at how small they are. Literally they are a zero figure. Look at their faces. तंबाकू खाऊन जीभ लाल झाली असे ते lions आहेत. And I don't know, in the middle of that flag they have drawn another third lion at the top. I don't know what is this. What kind of art is this? I still don't get it. So British art is like Indus Valley script. It's difficult to decipher. You just don't know what exactly they mean to tell. But yeah, this is British East India Company's logo. The earliest logo. The logo changed later on, but this is the earliest logo of the British East India Company. Wherever you will find Britain being shown, lions are always shown. Just like in China, we have a dragon being shown. In India, you have normally a tiger or an elephant being shown. In Britain, they normally represent themselves as a lion. So this is the logo of the British East India Company. So now let's deal with the British East India Company. The Queen had no chill. 31 डिसेंबर होता, सगळे न्यू इयरची पार्टी करत असतात, पण ह्या बाईला काय शांतता नव्हती. This woman gave a charter to the East India Company on 31st December 1600. So on New Year's Eve, this woman gave up the charter to the British East India Company. At least म्हणजे नवीन वर्षी तरी सेटअप करायचं ना, 1st of January. आम्हाला ते लक्षात ठेवायला पण सोपं झालं असतं हिस्ट्रीवाल्यांना. पण नाही, 31st December. Before you go to the party, let's set up a British East India Company and then only you go to the New Year's. So they set up British East India Company on 31st of December 1600. They got an exclusive charter from the British government to trade with all the regions in the East. So even if there were any other private companies in Britain, they could not trade. It was the exclusive charter of the British East India Company, the right of this company to trade especially with India. It is an exclusive charter. You will know the importance of why I am so much focusing on exclusive charters when we will study the Charter Acts of 1813, 1833 and 1853. When we will study that, then you will remember why I am so much focusing on this word exclusive monopoly and exclusive charter. Just like the Dutch East India Company, you had the British East India Company being a joint stock company. They had shareholders. So the Portuguese came to India in 1500, the Dutch came in 1600, the British also came somewhere around 1600, French came in 1664. So the Portuguese were the earliest to come and the last to leave. So the British also woke up 100 years after the Portuguese. In 1600, this company was set up. They came to India. They started to see what kind of political situation exists in India. We are talking of 1600. So in 1606, Akbar died. So this was a massive Mughal empire in India. You will find that in southern part of India, the Bahmani kingdoms had split and the 5 Shahis had come up: Adil Shah, Nizam Shah, Qutub Shah, Imad Shah and Barid Shah. You had the Vijayanagar Empire just being defeated in 1565. So the situation in the peninsular India was very, very fluid. Although in northern parts of India, we had a massive Mughal empire. So the British were observing these political systems. So they get to know that we had no option but to go and please the Mughal emperor if we really want to set up base at any profitable coastal region in India. So they went to Jahangir, because in 1606 Akbar died, and from 1606 to 1627 we had Jahangir as the Mughal emperor. So they went to Jahangir. So you had this famous British head of the East India Company in India and a famous diplomat, Sir Thomas Roe. Sir Thomas Roe essentially went to Jahangir. He began to please him. Naturally, the Portuguese were already present there and pleasing the Mughal emperor. So the Portuguese also tried to play politics with the British ki inko hata do. You know, you only give us the right to trade. We don't want the British to come. But finally, in 1616, a farman was secured from Jahangir to start a factory at Surat. So if I ask a simple question, why Surat? Surat kashala? Surat was the most important trade center, port city of Mughal India. The most important. Maximum trade that happened through the seas from India to any place in the world was through Surat. Maximum revenue that the Mughal emperor generated through custom duties was through Surat. So Surat was the most important trading center of those regions. Trading also requires many other financial helps. So banking, insurance, and all these things, shipbuilding industry, everything existed in Surat. So it was a proper port city which was meant for trade. That is also the reason why Shivaji Maharaj raided Surat, because that is where the real wealth of the Mughal Empire lied. So you will find that Surat was the most important place of those times. So Surat is where the British finally said that we will have a factory being set up, because that is a place for trade also. When the European companies come there, you will have Indian products also brought there by the various merchants in India, and trade can be easily possible at a port city. So a port city is not just a port, but it's a marketplace also. That's why the British set up their East India Company's first factory at Surat. Factory was set up at Surat. Naturally, the British tried to fortify it, because as I told you, the aim was, like the Portuguese, we should have fortified settlement so that we can fight off any Indian army if at all that army comes to it, and that fortified settlement will be used for dominance in the seas also. So you will have the British setting up a factory in Surat. They start to buy finished products from India. In those times, what were the finished products? Mainly they were cotton textiles, silk textiles that were made in India, because cotton can be grown only in India. Cotton requires tropical hot weather to be grown. So cotton was grown in India. We had excellent artisans who could weave various kinds of cotton textiles, not just clothes, but bed sheets, pillow covers, and all curtains, and every kind of textile from cotton was made in India. And you will find very good quality cotton being there. The British picked up the cotton textiles. They picked up iron, various products of iron, because in those days iron was important for a war. They picked up gunpowder and all the other products. They had all kinds of spices being traded. So you will find all these things were picked up from Gujarat and sold at a very high prices in England. So you will find the British East India Company starts to gain profit. But British being British, naturally you will find that they were not satisfied with Surat. They wanted to expand their hold into other parts of India. So you will find that when other parts of India were being expanded, the British thought of slowly setting up bases in those regions which could be very, very profitable. So the third point is the most important one. The 3 main metro cities of India which were set up by the British were essentially all factory settlements trading settlements that the British took hold in the 1600s. So let's look at one by one. The earliest was Madras, 1639. So you had the Maharaja of Arcot. Arcot is a region in Tamil Nadu. So Maharaja of Arcot essentially gave this port land of Madras Pattanam to the British, and that's why the British called it Madras. You will have this region as a small village. The British set up their settlement in Madras, and in Madras you will have with the British fortifying their settlement and building up a big navy for themselves. So this is Madras. Madras also has the earliest municipal corporation in this country, because that was the earliest in the time when it was set up. So this was Madras, which they got from Maharaja of Arcot, which was very easy also, because in southern India the kings were not that powerful also and not that aware also of what the British designs were. The second place where the British got their literally bonanza is because the Bombay region. So we had the Sashti region, that is the mainland Mumbai, and the 7 islands of Mumbai. So this region was under the control of the Portuguese. Remember I told you Portuguese were there at Vasai, just north of Mumbai. They were defeated in 1739, but they were there in this entire Bombay region since start. They were the ones who built up maximum churches in this region. They were the ones who began converting people, and they were the ones who set up all the important forts. Vasai, Bandra, Dongri, and all the other forts in this region were set up by the Portuguese. But as fate would have it, in 1662 you had the Catherine of Braganza. She's the princess in the Portuguese royal family, being married to a prince in Britain's royal family. So naturally the Portuguese wanted to give dowry to the British. So they said, you please take these islands of Bombay. So the islands of Bombay were essentially gifted to the British. So the British got the Bombay control as a dowry. That's a very strange thing, because in these times you had to get control through politics, through wars and everything. The British got hold of Bombay through dowry. You know, naseeb kis ka. Lucky people. So they got hold of of Bombay. The British began constructing, filling up all those 7 islands in Bombay, and they began constructing their fortified settlement. So you will have the most important fort of Mumbai, which is today called as fort. So if you go to Mumbai, the southern part of Bombay, that is Kala Ghoda region, where Shivaji Vastu Sangrala is there, the docks of naval docks of Mumbai, even today the Mazgaon docks and all that region. So all the region below the CST, that is essentially called as a fort region in Mumbai today. That is the place where the British built their fortified settlement in Bombay. That was the place where trade happened. So today's Mumbai's port, that is the dock of Mumbai, was the dock built by the British from where they used to trade with Europe, and that is also the place where their fortified settlement existed. Today it is called as the Mazgaon dock, taken over by our navy. So that is the place where it existed. You will be surprised to know that till almost 1860s, 70s, the big fortifications of this fort existed in Mumbai city. It existed till 1860s. Because the British were still not sure whether they would get hold of Mumbai or not. After 1857 revolt, and when the British Queen finally took over all the empire in India, then finally a committee was appointed by the then Bombay Municipal Corporation about what to do with these fortified big walls in the city, and then finally it was decided that we should destroy all these walls. That's why the fort as such today does not exist in Mumbai. All the walls of the fort were destroyed, and the British settlements began expanding even beyond that fort in South Mumbai. But that fort existed. Similarly, if you go in Madras, the British had to build up their fortified settlement. They built it even today. It exists even today. It is called Fort St. George. So Fort St. George was set up in Madras. Even today, the Mantralaya of Tamil Nadu government, the Chief Minister's residence, and all the important state government buildings, they are even today present in this settlement of Fort St. George in Tamil Nadu even today. So you can see how continuity has been there. Similarly, the third place is where the British now began to set up their base. That was in Bengal. You remember Bengal was the most prosperous region in India in those times, because it had flat land, plenty of water, rivers, favorable tropical climate for cultivation of various crops, and it had industry in itself where artisans used to produce finished products in those regions. And then we had sea near to Bengal from where it could be traded throughout the world. So naturally Bengal had a lot of money power in those days. So the British felt that we should have some settlement in Bengal. So they went to the Nawab of Bengal. Nawab of Bengal actually came a little bit later, but in the earlier times it was in the control of the Mughals. They got hold of 3 villages: Govindpur, Sutinati and Kalikata. These were the 3 villages in which they got control of, and these 3 villages combined together on the one side of the river of Hooghly. They together formed the settlement of Calcutta. So Kalikata settlement was the name adopted, hence Calcutta. So this Calcutta settlement was built up by the British on the banks of the Hooghly in late 1600s, about 1698 if I am not wrong. Yeah, 1698 is when the British finally built the fortified settlement of Calcutta. Naturally the Hooghly river was there. You could trade and set your ships in the Hooghly river and right through the Bay of Bengal enter the seas. So this Calcutta settlement was built, and the main core fort of the British is called Fort St. Williams. So like Fort St. George in Madras, we had Fort St. Williams being built in Calcutta. So this Calcutta region, Fort St. Williams, it exists even today. Mind you, it exists even today. And the boundary walls may not exist, but certain buildings that were built inside the Fort St. Williams exist even today. So all your race course, Victoria Memorial and all these main regions in Calcutta today, they essentially form the part of Fort St. Williams in those days. So all the 3 main regions of Calcutta were now 3 main cities, Madras, Bombay and Calcutta, were now being occupied by the British, and these developed as major trading centers and metro cities, and they hold that position even today in India. So these 3 cities were essentially got hold by the British in 1600s. You will find that the British also spread in many other regions of India. So you have Vengurla. So Vengurla, Rajapur and all these were main regions where even the Marathas found it very difficult for kicking out the British. It was a successful raid by Chhatrapati Shivaji on Rajapur settlement where the British finally, their foothold on the Konkan coast was reduced to nothing. Apart from Bombay, the British were reduced to nothing on the Konkan coast because of Chhatrapati Shivaji. You will also find, as I told you, how the British were very, very tactful people. They began interfering in the local politics. So when they got to know that the Maratha Empire is rising, this first started to appease Shivaji Maharaj that okay, we are with you, we are for you, please allow our trade, don't stop our trade. But the moment Shivaji Maharaj got into the Panhala siege by Siddhi Johar, the British realized that no, we should again appease the Adil Shahi kingdom because Marathas are going to be defeated. So there Henry Remington gave support of cannons to Siddhi Johar, and those cannons were used to bombard the Panhala fort. So Shivaji Maharaj observed how these British were playing politics, and that's why he sacked their Rajapur settlement on the coast and they destroyed all the British settlement. So the British presence on the Konkan coast was destroyed by the Marathas except for Bombay. But then they set up bases at Balasore, Masolipatna and many other places. So you will find that slowly the British are consolidating their hold on the coastal region of India. And naturally they are also fighting wars with the Portuguese. So war of dominance is there with the Portuguese. In these 1600s you will find that the British fought wars with the Dutch, as I had mentioned. The Dutch were thrown out of India. The British fought wars with Portuguese also. The Portuguese dominance was restricted to Diu Daman, Dadra Nagar Haveli and Goa. And finally, the only enemy that was left was French, which was there in Chandan Nagar, Pondicherry, Mahe, Karaikal, Masulipatna and all the other major centers. But one more aspect that generally is missed with the East India Company is what was happening in England. Mind you, if the East India Company had exclusive charter from the king, naturally the king will want something in return. ऐसा तो नहीं होगा that the king will just say that okay, you just go trade and I'll just give you permission. The king will demand something in return. As it turns out, the East India Company was essentially paying very, very big bribes to the king himself as well as the various parliamentarians in UK. So mind you, in Britain, 1689 is a very, very important year because since we are talking of 1600s only, so we are all in 1600s. In 1689, you will have a glorious revolution happening in Britain. What was that? You will have King Charles being thrown out and Mary and her husband William being crowned as the king. Why was this a revolution? It's because this is the start of parliamentary democracy in Britain. So the king became the monarch, but he was only the head of the state. The actual affairs of Britain were now taken over by the parliament. So your House of Lords and House of Commons was set up after 1689, and you will have Parliament of Britain, proper set of elections being happening in Britain. That system came up in 1689. So naturally, when the new king and the new parliamentarians came, they were suspicious of East India Company. ये 100 साल से trade कर रहे. They are from 1600 till 1689. They are there in India, earning massive profits and everything. Why are they doing this? So like, why are we not getting a share? So East India Company, you will find, was indulged in a lot of bribery of the king. They gave bribes to parliamentarians to ensure that the exclusive trade that the British East India Company had was maintained. Mind you, they were trading with a charter. They had a permission from the monarch to trade with India. The monarch, if new monarch came, that new monarch can actually suspend that charter. This will actually create a lot of problems. So they bribed the king, they bribed the parliamentarians and everything. Now again, logically speaking, was East India Company the only company capable of trading? No. There were many other merchants in Britain who were also willing to trade with India. Because like East India Company is a company, there can be many other companies, right? They can be shareholding companies, they could have money, but they could not trade with India because your East India Company had an exclusive charter given by the monarch. So what happened was, this exclusive charter of British East India Company was taken away, and the rivals of East India Company set up a company. The name of the company was New Company. Like as simple British names that could be. New Company. Khatam. There is no other big name. New Company. This new company was also started to have trade with India. Naturally, this created competition for British East India Company. So what happened was, how smart these British are. The East India Company of British, they started to buy shares in this new company. And at one point of time, they bought so much shares of this new company that this new company was merged in the British East India Company. So they, by intrigues essentially, they got hold of this new company, and this new company being dissolved and finally merged with the British East India Company. The British East India Company got its exclusive charter back again. So by the start of 1700s, you will have the British East India Company again being in a very dominant position within Britain to trade with India. And this was continued till 1833, when you will find slowly that the exclusive monopolies were being taken away, and finally the East India Company got dissolved in 1857. So now this was about what we talked of the 1600s. We saw the Portuguese, we saw the Dutch, French as well as the British. So let's look at certain photos first. This is the British East India Company headquarters in London. There is a street called Leadenhall Street. This building doesn't exist today, it was destroyed. But this is the headquarters of East India Company. Imagine in 1600s and 1700s, a company gaining so much of profits that they could build up such huge headquarters. Look at that building, typical Saracenian style, Gothic style architecture, and a huge building, and this is the headquarters of British East India Company. So imagine the kind of profits these people might have gained in this entire process, that they finally felt like building such a huge headquarters. This is the pencil sketch of a EIC factory at Surat. EIC is East India Company. East India Company factory at Surat, just see how crude it is, but it is fortified. It is definitely fortified, and it is existing at the banks of the Tapi river, and from there where it can access the sea. So this is the British East India Company headquarters at Surat. These East India companies had employed people who used to come there for training. They were called as factors. So the people working at a factory are called factors. These people left behind their diaries, their papers and records, and these papers and records are the most important sources of history for us to know what exactly the British, the French, the Portuguese were doing. They are important records for medieval India also, because you will find, for example, say the Maratha history. There were many records by British and Portuguese factors in that factory, because they used to interact with the Marathas and their kings and the people other than the kings, and they left behind crucial sources of information about what was happening in the Maratha Empire. So these form various important sources of history for us also. So this is the factory of EIC at Surat. And this is the Writers' Building, which they built in 1777. They built it quite later, but the Writers' Building in Calcutta. Remember, Calcutta was later on declared as the capital of the East India Company's possessions in India. It was the capital of India till 1911, when the capital was finally shifted to New Delhi. So the capital city of East India Company was there in Calcutta. So naturally they had to build an imposing big building where the Viceroy or the earlier Governor General can sit, his ministers can sit, and they can govern India. So they built a brilliant red colored building called the Writers' Building. It is there even today. Even today, the Chief Minister of Bengal and the entire cabinet secretariat sits in this Writers' Building. It is there even today. It is just in the vicinity of Fort St. Williams. This is the place where entire India's future was being decided. So mind you, this is a very powerful building. The Viceroy, all his ministers, Finance Minister, Home Minister, his military commanders, everybody sat in this building. So this is an important position of power that Calcutta held in those days. Okay, so we have ended 1600s now. Now we are entering the 1700s. So what is called as the 18th century. So we are into 18th century India, where we want to see how the British and the French finally were left and how they were forced to expand and fight wars with themselves. So this is how the map of the 18th century India looked. The Maratha Empire had grown. We had Bajirao the first in 1723, finally conquering Delhi, and later on we had Nanasaheb Peshwa and then other Peshwas, and we had the Maratha Confederacy. So we had the Holkars of Indore, we had the Gaikwads of Baroda, the Bhosles of Nagpur and the Shindes of Gwalior being part of the Maratha Confederacy, the Peshwas of Pune, and all of them reporting to the Chhatrapati sitting at Satara. So this is the Maratha Empire which occupies the major part of India in 18th century. If you see towards the northwest, you had Lahore and Multan. Earlier these were Muslim states, later on they became Sikh states. So the Sikhs began rising in the northwestern parts. Sindh was a Muslim state and so was Gujarat. In the UP region you will have Awadh. So the British called it as Oudh, O-U-D-H, but that's essentially Awadh kingdom. This is majorly ruling the Ganga valley. You will find this Awadh kingdom most important because when we will study the battle of Plassey and the battle of Buxar, we have Siraj-ud-Dawla as the ruler of Bengal and the rulers of Awadh tying up together and finally trying to fight against the British. And then finally in the Bengal region we had the massive Bengal kingdom. This Bengal region in 1600s was under the control of the Mughals, but as Aurangzeb died in 1707, that is the start of 18th century, the Mughal Empire began disintegrating and the governors of Bengal began declaring independence. So you had Murshid Quli Khan declaring independence. That's why he built his capital at Murshidabad in Bengal. You had his son Alivardi Khan and his grandson Siraj-ud-Dawla being the ruler, the Nawabs of Bengal. If you come down to the Deccan region, you had the Nizam or the Wazir of the Mughal king in early 18th century. He finally got frustrated with the Mughal Empire. They said, screw you, the Marathas are already powerful, I don't want to sit in Delhi. So he came down south. His name was Nizam-ul-Mulk, and he set up a kingdom in Hyderabad which is called as the Nizam Shahi, the new Nizam Shahi, not the ones we study in the Maratha history. So this is the Nizam of Hyderabad, Nizam-ul-Mulk, ruling from Hyderabad, and he took hold of the many regions of Andhra and Tamil Nadu region. So this is Nizam's dominions. And of course after the Vodiyar dynasty of this entire Mysore region was defeated, we had Tipu Sultan and his father Hyder Ali being taking hold of Mysore region. So Mysore, Nizam, Marathas, Awadh, Bengal, these are the most important kingdoms that the British had to fight in 18th century if they really wanted to have an empire in India. So that's why we should know all these kingdoms and where they exist. You will have one more kingdom in south which is not shown here. It is the Nawab of Carnatic. So there was one more kingdom over here. The Nawab of, and the kingdom, he had a Nawab. Hence they were called as the Nawab of Carnatic. We will also hear about the reference to this Nawab of Carnatic in the later part. But this is how 18th century India looked, primarily dominated by the Marathas. Okay. Now finally we come to the most important struggle of this time. I told you these kingdoms existed and the only two European powers that were finally in 18th century poised to take hold of India were either the French or the British. Either of them, whosoever would have won and defeated the other, would have reaped huge profits because they would now have exclusive monopoly over European trade with India. Because mind you, if British supposedly traded with India, the finished products that they took away from India were not merely sold in Britain. They were sold in other parts of Europe also. So naturally, any European power which will have some dominance over European trade with India will have exclusive profits that it can gain by selling those products in Europe. So naturally, the French and the British fought with each other to gain dominance. So only two big European powers remain. You will have the British mainly concentrated in Calcutta and Madras. Bombay was not a big settlement then because the Marathas were too much powerful and Bombay was surrounded by the Marathas. So you will find that not much power was there in Bombay. But Bengal and Madras were essentially green zones, neutral zones where you can actually expand. So Calcutta was the most important settlement of the British and Madras was a very, very good military settlement. Similarly, the French had Chandan Nagar in Bengal as the settlement and Pondicherry as the settlement. But as Providence may be, the French made a big blunder. They shifted their capital city from Chandan Nagar to Pondicherry in 1731. So British continued to have their capital in Calcutta, but the French shifted their capital from Bengal to Pondicherry in 1731. Now historians believe this to be the biggest blunder. We will see later on why. But Pondicherry was now the capital of the French. The British East India Company had a very good military commander called Robert Clive. We have all heard this name, Robert Clive. He is also involved in the Battle of Plassey and everything. So Robert Clive is essentially the military commander of the East India Company. He is not just a trader, but he is a very supreme naval commander. This proved to be a very good factor for the British to win against the French. On the contrary, the French sent a very capable officer in 1741 to Pondicherry, which was their capital. The name of this officer was Dupleix. So Dupleix was a very good diplomat. He was very good at playing intrigues and doing all kinds of backroom politics. But he was not a good naval commander. This was also a big problem. But Dupleix and Robert Clive, this is the clash of two personalities now. Robert Clive trying to gain British dominance and Dupleix trying to gain French dominance in the Bay of Bengal and overall in India. And this is where the entire fight started. So what was fought essentially in the decade of 1740s and 1750s was the Anglo-French War. So Anglo essentially British. So Anglo-French wars were fought in 1740s. There were three in number. So we will deal with all these three wars. Many a times this question may be asked in GS and as well as in optional. So you please consider this as a very important part. So what happened was there was some skirmishes that started to happen between the British and the French because Pondicherry is just to the north of Madras. So they are very close to each other. So you will find that the British started to attack Pondicherry. The French in return attacked Madras and they captured Madras. So there was a lot of fighting, but it was a nil fight because both had each other's territories in their hands. So finally, status quo was restored in 1748. So you will find that the first Anglo-French struggle was a damp squib. It was a tiebreaker. Nothing much happened. This attack as such, what I tell you, was happening through the sea because these were naval powers. On land, their armies were not much in number because naturally how many British and French could come to India. So their numbers on land were limited, but they had very strong military presence. So they attacked each other's naval settlements. Now started the real politics. The French, the Dupleix essentially was a very smart man. What he said was that if I start as a French, if I start to fight with the British people, I may not be in a very good position. What if I get the support from an Indian king? So why not involve an Indian king in our wars? Two European countries were fighting, France versus Britain. But if I involve an Indian king with it, I'll get resources, I can get land, I can get military support, everything. So what the French did was, they started to interfere in internal politics of Indian kingdoms. So in this Madras region or the southern region, there were two main kingdoms. Remember I told you there was a Nizam at Hyderabad and I told you there was a Nawab of Carnatic. Carnatic is essentially Karnataka region, so it's called Carnatic. So Nawab of Carnatic and the Nizam of Hyderabad. traditionally in history, any kingdom is at its weakest when there is a succession struggle happening. A kingdom may have strong enemies outside, but the weakest that a kingdom can be from inside is when a succession struggle happens within the royal family, because there are multiple claimants to the throne and those people can go to any level to get that throne. In these cases, most of the times, a third party, a person sitting outside the kingdom, is often asked for help, and that third party comes to help with its own cost after all. So this was the time when succession struggle was problematic in Carnatic as well as Nizam. So the Nawab of Carnatic his successor wanted to be a person called Chanda Sahib, and in Nizam, his successor wanted to be a person called Muzaffar Jung. What Dupleix did was, he told Chanda Sahib and Muzaffar Jung that the French will support you in your throne capturing process, that we will want you to capture throne. In return, you give us your land. So now the French are actually asking for giving land in return. You give us land so that we can collect revenue from that land and gain money, and you give us military support against the British. These two people readily agreed. The typical problematic Indian way of thinking, that for our personal gains we can go to any level, even tie up with a third party. So the European powers realized that you can actually give some gains to Indians and get their loyalty, even if it is at the detriment of India. So they got to know that Indians are corrupt by mind. They can go to any level to secure their privileges. So the French started to take hold of certain parts of Nizam and the territories of Carnatic by supporting Chanda Sahib and Muzaffar Jung. So what happened was, in case of Chanda Sahib, the British got hold of this, that entire conspiracy is happening. The French with Chanda Sahib actually got hold of the throne of Carnatic, and they pushed away the Nawab of Carnatic outside their kingdom. What Nawab of Carnatic did? He went to the British. So if Chanda Sahib is supported by the French, Nawab of Carnatic went to the British at Tiruchirappalli or Trichinopoly as it is called then, and there he took sharad or took shelter with the British, that finally he wanted the British to help him get back his throne. So now on one side you have Chanda Sahib supported by French and the actual Nawab of Carnatic supported by the British. And naturally the French and the British began fighting with each other with the help of these two kings. So what happened was, the British attacked Arcot and other surrounding regions and tried to take hold of Pondicherry. And the French started to attack the British provinces with the help of Chanda Sahib and all these regions, all these people. What happened was that this war stretched a little bit too far from 1752 to 54, and the French finally could not get hold of any British provinces. The French had to withdraw, and Nawab of Carnatic was again restored and Chanda Sahib was killed. So the French lost and their allies also lost. Parallelly speaking, what was happening in Europe was that France and Britain, these two mother countries themselves, were at war. So if they were at war in India, they were at war even in Europe. So you have a 6 or 7 years war, 1756 to 1763. This is the time where a 7 years war broke out between Britain and France in England. They were fighting even in North America. Remember, North America was the 13 colonies of Britain, where North America existed. And you will have the French having their colonies in Quebec and all the other regions in Canada. So you will find they are nearby. So naturally you will have a war that was happening between Britain and France even in North America, in Europe as well as in India. So this was a time of war, general war between French and the British people. The British won in India, the French lost, they could not hold their strategic ally, and finally Nawab of Carnatic got hold of his throne again. So the French, they held this man Dupleix responsible for all the failures, and they recalled him in 1754. This was a major blunder because Dupleix की वजह से जितना वॉर था उतना हो रहा था. तो जेवढं युद्ध होत होतं तेवढं Dupleixमुळेच होत होतं. You called back your most efficient man, and then finally the entire French enterprise in India was suffered very heavily, very heavily. And finally you will have the British deciding a final war with the French in 1760. The war started because the French were in Masulipatna and British tried to repulse the French in Masulipatna, and finally at a place in Bay of Bengal called Vandivash, this war happened and the French were conclusively defeated by the British Navy. The French accepted defeat And in 1763, there was a Treaty of Paris that happened. In the Treaty of Paris, you will find that the British asked the French that you will be restricted henceforth only in Pondicherry, in Mahe, Karaikal, Yanam and all these regions, and you will not go beyond these regions. And the French accepted. They recalled their navy. Already Dupleix was recalled. So you will find that the French were conclusively defeated in 1760, and that is when amongst those two European powers, the French and the British now got prominence in India. The French were also defeated, the Portuguese were already restricted, the Dutch were thrown out of India, and now finally, at least amongst the European powers, Britain had the dominance. Britain was actually nowhere in India because it had small bases. India was massively dominated by the Marathas in this region. But at least amongst the European powers, Britain was the only one left. The French were defeated. And by 1769, the French East India Company was dissolved. So I told you the French simply give up. Like if we got defeated in 1760, let's dissolve our company in 1769. So they finally gave up. Like, okay, bhai, all these 3-4 regions that we have, we will have it. We will not further have any war with the British. So the British conclusively defeated the French. Now a question, analytical question may be asked, that fine, the French was defeated and the British got hold of, but was the British victory really that prominent? Because the Marathas were still there, mind you. In 1757, just 3 years before this war, the Battle of Plassey had happened, where British had got good foothold in Bengal, but yet again the Marathas were there. So you will find that although the British were securing these victories, small victories, their position in India was still weak, because they were yet to fight with the Indian powers. Till now they were just fighting with the foreign powers. But the British got a lot of confidence. They got to know that by intrigues and by corruption, they can actually make Indian people fight from the side of the British and against their own people. And that is where the real problem began. So you will find that the French were conclusively defeated. So if I really want to analyze this aspect, why the French lost? Why did the French lose? So these are some of the reasons that can be listed out. So if we actually see that there is weakness in the governance structure of French East India Company. The British gave a lot of freedom to their East India Company. They had exclusive charters. The East India Company could conduct wars and do whatever they want. The French East India Company governance was not that very good. It was totally restrictive. You have very bureaucratic structure and they could not take decisions fast. This was one of the major reasons why the French East India Company could not compete with the British East India Company. The second reason was monarchical control. In Britain, you had East India Company as a private company, a shareholding joint stock company. The monarch had no role to play in the functioning of the East India Company. He had no control over it. He could only give charters. The French East India Company essentially was owned by the monarch. So monarch was a major shareholder in the East India Company of French, and that's why the monarch could, the monarch, as it is, the French monarchs were never that visionary. So the monarchical control was there, because of which again there was a lot of restrictions. You will find various, if you remember during French Revolution, we studied the first estate, second estate and third estate. The first estate was the clergy, second estate was all the military people, aristocracy, and the third estate were the common people. So the second estate, that is aristocracy, even they invested in the French East India Company, and you will find that essentially East India Company shareholders were the military men and the king. They were there in France. How are they supposed to know what conditions are there in India? Mind you, we are talking of a time when there was no telephone, no telegraph, no internet, and it took almost months from France to reach to India. So if you really want to take some decision in India, you have to give freedom to the people in India. You can't micromanage from France, but they did try it. And that's why the French East India Company could not take quick decisions in the favor of their country. The third reason was shifting of capital from Bengal to Pondicherry. I called it a blunder. It's because, see boss, you are here for trade, you are here for money. If I have to give a choice, where will maximum revenue come from? Will it come from Bengal or will it come from Madras? It's obviously going to come from Bengal, because Bengal has flat land, water, it has resources, it has good tropical climate, it has artisans and industry, everything is present. The Madras region is essentially a dry region. वाटर का प्रॉब्लम है, एग्रीकल्चर इज नॉट प्रॉस्परस, यू कैन नॉट ग्रो कॉटन, जूट एंड मेनी अदर प्लेसेस बिकॉज वाटर इज अ प्रॉब्लम. And plus this region is not good for trade. Trade happened only properly through Bengal. So you will find that the French decision to shift their capital from Chandannagar on the banks of Hooghly to Pondicherry proved to be a big blunder. The British retained their capital at Calcutta. Madras was just one fortified settlement of the British, but the British capital was there at Calcutta. In this entire war, shifting your capital to a very backward region, and that too again captured by the British, this proved to be a big blow to the French. So that was a strategic blunder for the French to actually shift their capital from Bengal to Pondicherry. The next reason was recall of Dupleix. I told you Dupleix was the smart person who actually started to interfere in the internal politics of Bengal. So once he started to interfere in the internal politics of Bengal, he could have won. You should have actually given him freedom. You should have given him more power that you decide and then you please defeat the British. But they recalled Dupleix. Dupleix of course had its own drawbacks. He was not a military man. He was a diplomat. Robert Clive on the other hand was a military man as well as a diplomat. He knew how to command the army, the navy of the British and got a victory. On the contrary, Dupleix was not a military man. Count de Lally was the military commander of the French there in Pondicherry, and there was little coordination between Dupleix and Count de Lally, and finally the French navy could not sustain in front of the British because there was no uniformity of command. Fifth factor, that's why I said that world history is very important when we study modern India. I have written there that there was focus on American colonies. Why do I say this? Remember I told you that there was a 7 years war and the British were fighting the French even in the Americas. So there were 13 British colonies on the eastern coast of America, New York, Philadelphia and all these things, which later on of course became United States of America in 1789. The French had colonies in Quebec, Montreal and all the other regions in Canada. The French valued the North American possessions more than the Indian possessions. So they felt that if a war is there with British, it is better to divert all our supplies to the war in North America rather than focus in India. So Dupleix was asking the French government that please allow me to fortify Pondicherry, fortify the French settlements, because if the British attack we have nothing to defend. But that was not allowed because all the resources were diverted to North America. Finally the French lost in North America, the British won, and finally even the French lost in India also. So that was a critical problem that the French decided to not to fortify Pondicherry. Logic of Dupleix was that forget British, but Marathas were there, Mysore was there, all these kingdoms were there. If they decide to attack the French, how are you going to defend ourselves? But the French decided not to fortify Pondicherry, and the end result of all of this was that the French East India Company was dissolved in 1769. The French could not hold anything properly with on their footholds, and the British finally won in India, and now the entire land was open for British conquest. So the British finally realized that we had to do something. Now once the French are defeated, the British turned their attention towards Indian kingdoms, and when I say Indian kingdoms, the most prominent was the Maratha kingdom. But before Marathas, the British knew that Bengal is something which is really profitable, and that is why there is a need to gain foothold in Bengal. So you will have the British efforts in 1740s more concentrated on Bengal. If they somehow get foothold in Bengal, somehow if they are able to capture land. When you capture land, what does it mean? You get hold of villages, right? Villages, there are farmers are cultivating crops. You can charge land revenue from the farmers. You get hold of Calcutta or the other surrounding regions, you get hold of artisans. You get control over the finished products of this region, and then you can actually take those finished products and sell it in Britain. So Bengal became the main center of the British once the French were defeated, or side by side whenever the war with French was happening. But 1740s and 1750s is when the British largely started to focus on Bengal. Okay, the conquest of Bengal. So now this is the time when the British are first trying to gain a foothold in India. Conquest of Bengal. You find Aurangzeb died in 1707. There was a lot of problem. Farrukh Siyar became the Mughal emperor in 1710s. So in 1717, the British got a farman from Farrukh Siyar to set up a factory and continuously trade in Calcutta. They already had a factory there, but the farman was special because the British asked for concessions in revenue, because when you set up a factory in Calcutta or in Surat or anyway, you have to pay heavy fees to the Mughal emperor because he has allowed you to set up that factory. So they asked for revenue concessions, that please don't charge us this custom duty or anything of that sort. They asked for special concession saying that rather than you charging us custom duty, we will pay you a fixed fee every year and you just give us rights to trade. So even if the British traded more than that fixed fee, still that profit will be to the British, but we will give you a fixed fee. So that kind of things were happening. In these times, Bengal became independent. I told you the Nawab of Bengal set up himself as an independent ruler. You will have Alivardi Khan and his son Siraj-ud-Dawla finally getting hold of Bengal. So you will find that the British actually are trying to gain their foothold around Calcutta. Even during the Mughal times, they had tried to fortify Calcutta and the Mughal armies had simply come and destroyed their settlement in Calcutta. So you will find that the British somehow could not gain much foothold. But once the Nawab was there, an independent ruler, they tried to extract more and more concessions. How corruption happened under the British, how they tried to extract money, they were allowed to issue dastaks. Dastak is essentially an exemption from paying a custom duty. So you will not be charged custom duty if you have a dastak. What the British started to do was, they tried to give that dastak even to their Indian friends. So there were merchants in Bengal. I told you it was a prosperous province. So there were many merchants, the most prominent being Jagat Seth. And these people started to get dastaks from the British, and they even started to trade without revenue, without giving custom duty. The Nawabs of Bengal realized that they are being conned, they are being fooled. They are losing out on revenue because the British are trying to do illegal means. Side by side, in 1740s, the Bengal was ruled essentially by Siraj-ud-Dawla. Siraj-ud-Dawla was seeing that in 1740s, how the British were troubling Nizam of Hyderabad, Carnatic, and even the Maharaja of Arcot. So he realized that the intentions of the British were not good. They were intending to capture territory. They will continue to restrict the revenues of the kingdom, and then one fine day they will just capture it. So Siraj-ud-Dawla, the Nawab of Bengal, was now being very, very suspicious of the British. He began restricting the British activity. He began restricting their trade and everything. So you will find that first biggest attack that happened against the British by Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla was the attack on Qasim Bazar. So he attacked the British settlement at Qasim Bazar, and at Qasim Bazar you will find that the British were defeated. There were many British people who were killed, but somehow the British managed to escape into the Bay of Bengal. So you will find that sometime in 1757 you have this problem happening. The British on their side were also knowing that Nawab of Bengal was not going to make us allow us to do trade properly. So what they did was, through their experience in Madras, they realized that you can actually make Indians fight from your side if you have money and if you manage to pursue their interests. So if the Indians get the guarantee that their interests are going to be protected, they will do anything for that. They will even support the British against their own people. So the British got to know this. So when these things were happening, this Qasim Bazar attack and everything was happening, the British on their side did a lot of intrigues. They tried to ensure that political rivalry starts for the Nawab of Bengal. So there was a person called Mir Qasim. Mir Qasim actually started to ensure, he was essentially touted as a very person who could replace the Nawab of Bengal. I'm sorry, the name of the person was Mir Jafar. So Mir Jafar was essentially touted as a replacement to Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla. So the British started to appease this Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar essentially was the Senapati or military commander of the Bengal army. So finally, when the British decided to avenge the defeat of Qasim Bazar, these two armies decided to meet at a place called Palasi in Bengal. Hence the British call it Plassey. There the Nawab's armies under Mir Jafar came. On the other side, there was the British army. But the British simply did not fight the war because Mir Jafar, the own military commander of Siraj-ud-Dawla, acted treacherously and his entire army refused to fight. And finally, Siraj-ud-Dawla was defeated because the army itself refused to fight, and Siraj-ud-Dawla was captured and put to death. Why? Because his military commander was an ally of the British. So see how intrigues and how politics the British were playing. And that's why on 23rd of June 1757, it's called as a No Battle of Plassey. So battle did take place, but actually nobody fought, because even before the battle took place, the Bengal Nawab surrendered because he had no army left. So the British finally took hold of Bengal. Now, if you see how this battle is seen, this is where the British finally got some foothold in India. So this is touted as the start of the British Empire in India. If you see historians like Sir Jadunath Sarkar, they call it the start of modern age in India, because this is how the British got hold, and the British brought many modern things into India. So it is also touted as the start of modern age in India. People also say that this is the start of loot in Bengal, because the British got hold, they made Mir Jafar as the Nawab of Bengal, and making him as the Nawab of Bengal, they started to extract revenue from Nawab of Bengal. We will see that in the next lecture, but you will find that the entire revenues of Bengal were now being strained by the British, and the British now finally got hold of some major parts of Bengal. But you will also find that the British were in a precarious condition. Let's see analysis. 1757 is when the British won in Bengal. The French were yet to be defeated. Mind you, the third Anglo-French battle happened in 1760, not in 1757. So the French were yet to be defeated. This was a no battle of Plassey, as in the British military might was not put to test. They went through intrigues, not because they fought an open war. So still the capability of the British army was questionable. The Britain was under a 7 years war that was happening with France. You never knew what settlement could be done at the level of the monarch. One fine day the monarch will say that, okay, we have settled with the French, you have to give up Calcutta to the French. You never know. So you will find that again there was uncertainty. And the most important factor is you had the Marathas ruling major parts of India. The moment the Marathas decide to simply come and capture you, the force of the Marathas was so huge that you could just blow away like anything. In those times, in 1740s and 50s, the Marathas were concentrated on the northwest frontier. Remember, it is this time when Nadir Shah had invaded, Marathas had secured their victory till Attock, and this was the time when Ahmad Shah Abdali was invading into India. Remember, Battle of Panipat was 1761, Battle of Plassey 1757. So the Marathas were totally concentrated on the northwestern frontier of India. Had Marathas won in 1761 and they had secured the northwestern frontier of India, the natural next place of attack was Bengal, because the British were expanding there. So this 1757 victory of Plassey was still a very dicey victory. It was not really a victory. There were many factors that could have actually destroyed this British victory forever. So you will find that Battle of Plassey was just the start. It is the next Battle of Buxar that happened in 1764 is when the British finally got some confidence that they can really rule India as rulers and not as mere traders. That we will be seeing in the next session. We will see the Battle of Buxar, as in where the British got hold of Bengal. We will see the Anglo-Maratha wars where they defeated the Marathas. We will see the Anglo-Mysore wars, and so on and so forth. How the British slowly got hold of the Maratha regions in India. That we will be seeing in the next lecture. So